Welcome back to another Trident Wargaming Podcast. Today I am joined by Aiden Volmer, one of the members of our Trident Wargaming competitive team. And we're mostly going to be talking bringing a competitive mindset to Age of Sigmar. If you've met Aiden or if you played Warhammer 40k against myself, you know that we like to bring the heat. We like to play at some of the highest levels. And one of the things we really want to talk about today is whether or not that is applicable to Age of Sigmar. If it is, how it is applicable, and whether or not Age of Sigmar is that competitive game we wish 40k was. Bit of an inside joke there. Before we get into any of that, I'd really like to chat about Aiden's recent weekend at the Warhammer 40k Canadian Western Championships, where he, along with three other members of Trident Wargaming, were down there rolling dice, playing games. So, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, guys. So we played at a team event this weekend in Saskatoon. Um, it followed the WTC format, but it was very unorthodox, I guess, because instead of having 8 players as WTC normally does, or your 3 or 5 player setup, we had a 4 player setup. And so we went into that as a team, not really understanding how the draft was going to look. Obviously, having an even number, it gets pretty complicated. Um, and there was a surprising amount of depth to it. We went into it kind of expecting, everything's going to be random, everything's a coin flip. But we could, if we knew, engineer about 50% of our matchups going into it. And we started to take advantage of that as the tournament went on, which led to, more success. Otherwise, it was a great tournament. The competition's incredible. It felt like their average competitive player were our tippy top here in Edmonton. So really good practice for a lot of us on the team. We finished 5th, which is I think respectable, considering. And the format itself, like when you get sit down for the game, wild. The terrain, there was more terrain on the board than there wasn't, which informed a lot of other people's list building decisions. We didn't know that going into it. We just happened to have a couple players. Like I was on Thousand Suns. Ryan was on Votan, which helped to make a lot of that easy. There weren't really lines of sight outside of 18 inches. So having that kind of more short range concentrated firepower, like via Eldar, via T-Suns, ended up finding a lot of success. And we learned a lot about the format itself. And I think a lot of what we want to talk about today with Age of Sigmar, we can or I personally can draw from this event because it was so different than what I've been used to in not only 10th edition, but 9th edition. And how we can make list building choices and make decisions in game based on the fundamental game that we're playing and not just the rules themselves.
Now, do you think at these Western Canadian 40k championships, every single player had list choices that were specific to the missions? How much effort was placed into list building because they know that, oh, this mission might come up, this objective might come up, this deployment might come up, and I need X unit in here?
Well, I'll tell you. So the missions themselves were very, very, very simple. I think 3 of them were Chilling Rain, which is just nothing's going on, and 2 of them I think were whatever the one is where you split the center objective, so you have 6 objectives instead of 5. Very simple. The biggest thing that we did notice, and I ran into this in my second round, was because it's a 4-player format, lists were built just to be like, hey, we're going to throw you at whatever the scariest player is or whatever the scariest list is. And you're just going to try to get as many points as possible, just hit even. You don't need to win. You're never going to win, right? The list that I played into was a Necrons list that focused on big Lich Guard bricks and just not letting you score points, but simultaneously they're never getting a 90-30 or in WT scoring, they're never getting a 20-0. It's always going to be a 10-11, 12-8 if they're lucky. But that's the point, because that means that the rest of their players can get paired up into favorable matchups, and they don't have to worry about it, right? They're kind of equalizing the board for themselves. So that kind of decision making in lists led to success at the top 3 teams, in my opinion. They came second, the one that we played against, where their Necrons going into my T-Suns. They weren't able to kill me. I wasn't able to kill them. Therefore, I wasn't able to pull enough points to get our team to win. But yeah, as far as the mission themselves, I don't think a lot of people, given that this is the first Western Canadian Team Championships, I don't think a lot of players knew to bring that very short, concentrated like firepower. It was kind of all over the place, which I think is good for, as a community to learn the format. But
It's really
yeah,
interesting because when we look at like WTC or Europe meta versus like American meta or North American, it's been different. It's been different for years, and I think part of that is because of the density that they have for terrain. You kind of have to change the way that you think about the board with the models that you bring. And having like crazy long range firepower like fire prisms might not get you the effect you need on a board like that. But like old rules like the old school 40k Eldar battle focus would be incredible. Which makes you think like
yeah,
with those redeploy movements of Eldar or other armies might be very powerful.
incredibly. I played into Eldar in round 3, and I was unable to do anything because Phantasm represented such a powerful tool with like, very, very particular lines of sight. So
Now, if you were to go into it again, do you think that if you change the way you think about the board, you change the way you think about the mission, and you design for it, you'd be more successful?
I think that I almost on accident brought a really good list for this because I'm playing the Terminator brick.
Yep.
You funnel all your points into the Terminator brick. You kill something, you find that line of sight, and in a lot of ways that worked for me. I think that if I brought like a more rubric spam version, it would work, but it wouldn't get me the 20 O's that I ended up getting. It would have just like the Necron player just equalized, right? Versus like I think Ryan's list where he brought a lot of Sagittars, like transports, right? Those ended up being very bad in this format. So if we were to go back and maybe take away the Sagittars, turned it into another Terminator brick unit, that's incredible, right? So yeah, I think for our other teammates, I think next year we might be bringing something a little different. But I think personally, I just got lucky with what I brought.
Bringing those 1,000 cents. That's awesome.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd like to apply that sort of theory, that sort of thinking, those sort of ideas into playing Age of Sigmar at a competitive level. I know that it's played internationally at a competitive level with like they have a very well represented world scene, which stems from the old days of Warhammer Fantasy, where it was the most competitive war game, more so than 40k at the time. It did go into Ninth Age, and the company, well, it's not really a company, it's more like an organization that the crowd organization that has made Ninth Age. They have kept that extreme level of competitiveness, and they've actually applied that right into their base rule set, which for some people is fundamentally excellent because the game is insanely balanced and tweaked. But for some people, they're like, well, there's no independent characters. This game is boring. Which there is a, like, does unbalance make more fun? That's a whole other different discussion. But I want to talk about some of the competitive aspects about taking some of the ideas we have from 40k and apply that to Age of Sigmar. I think first on the docket is identifying unit power level and scaling those units in count. So when we apply that in Warhammer 40k, you're talking about those 1,000 Sun Terminator bricks. How many can you have? It is a fantastic unit. It takes a lot of points. You want one in your army. It's one of the best units in the game. You want two? Do you want three?
We had the other Thousand Sons player that came to the event ended up bringing two, and as a result, right, he didn't have the points to spend on support, so it ended up not doing as great because you're 5-inch walking at your opponent. You have no support to make you more effective. You're just another Terminator blob, right? With the advantage of getting to double move. That's what it was. In 40k, I think we are incentivized to kind of classify units in one of two broad categories and then subcategorize them from there. Like we have things that don't die or things that do damage, and those things we take as maximum unit size, and always have, right? We're never taking a 5-man when we can take a 10-man if the goal of the unit is to kill things, right? And simultaneously, like the Death Knights or whatever, right? We don't want them to get blown up. Versus like, we're taking minimum unit size when we're trying to actually play the game, and there isn't a lot of ambiguity when you're looking at a data sheet for what that unit should be. Like it's almost always like you're never taking, I don't think you can, but you're never taking a 5-man Terminator brick because like if you could, it's never going to fulfill the job that
Fucking tell that to the Custodes players right now.
Right. Well, right. That's what I'm saying, right? Like they've been hampered and they're not able to take like the strongest version of a custodian guard brick. So the faction's suffering for it. They become really expensive utility units without the damage output. Fight phase to fight phase, right? So
Now, in Age of Sigmar, we have something called the reinforce mechanic. And for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or getting into it or are curious about it, one of the mechanics is so for 40k, which many of our listeners are aware of, historically, you could have bought things model by model. You had to buy a minimum of a certain amount, and then from there, you could apply up to a maximum. So if you wanted to take Sisters of Battle, you could start in 5, but then you could play up to 10. The newest edition of 40k changed that, where they essentially sold whatever was in the box is what your data sheet is. And then, like, with very rare exceptions of you being able to extend that data sheet. In fact, I can't really think of any. And in some cases, them not being like, actually, no, putting 2 boxes together is not allowed. Sometimes it is. So they've been kind of specific about that. Age of Sigmar did it first, and I think they did it best. They have a mechanic called Reinforce, where you can take any data sheet in the game, and a data sheet pretty much comes as a box of models, except it's called a War Scroll. And you can double up on the amount of models in it. You can just add another data sheet to it. It becomes a unit that's twice the size. And an army can only do that up to 3 times. Now, units that are battle lines, so like your very core troops, this would have been the old troops sub list building archetype in Warhammer 40k. You can do this. You can do up to 3 times. You can reinforce them twice. You can reinforce them twice, but you're only allowed to do 3 reinforcements in the game. So, for example, playing Lumineth, I have Lumineth Wardens. They're like these spear boys. I'm allowed to reinforce them. Normally, they're a 10-man block. I can pump them up to 20, or I can pump them up to 30. However, there is the grand restriction that you can only reinforce something 3 times. So
it's 4 as a heads up. It's you have 4 points at 2,000.
4 points, 2,000. Okay, depends on how big the game is. How does that change how you balance a list in Age of Sigmar? Because, like, for example, I have a unit of Blade Lords, and they come base in 5. They have 2 wounds each, and they slap in combat. I think a 5-man unit doesn't actually have the offensive power to kill most of the things at once, so I want to reinforce it. And you can make it battle lines, you can actually do it once. I like it at the 10-man squad. Is it worth reinforcing it again? How do I know if 10-man or 15-man is the right size here? So when you talk Age of Sigmar, how do we identify like a unit power level? How many times we want to reinforce that? And just because something is good, does that mean we want more of it?
I think it depends on the unit. Do Blade Lords have an ability to fight first, or do they have any combat tricks?
Kind of. Like Lumineth always get to fight twice, right? I'm going to fight twice before you fight once. But Blade Lords have a specific trick in that they can choose to have extra attacks, or on a 2-up, they just automatically do a mortal.
Right. Okay. So I think the best example there's 2. I think best example of like what this looks like in game is skeletons, right? And Moon Clan Stabbas. With skeletons, I found that a 10-man acts. It's very cheap. It's 110 points, I believe. It can act as a screening unit. It can act as a zoning unit. It can act as a hang out in that corner, right? Go grab that objective and walk off.
And that's the base war scroll for skeletons, 10-man.
That's the base.
How many 10-man units of skeletons do you want in your army?
It depends, because a lot of times you're taking that 10-man because it happens to be the cheapest battle line you can take to go just do whatever.
Score an objective, screen an opponent, do something.
Right. Now, that being said, a lot of lists end up taking that to 30, spending 330 points on the skeletons. For those people who don't know, skeletons have an interesting mechanic where at the start of every combat phase, you count the amount of ones that are dead, you roll a dice for each. On a 4+, they come back. So they're incredibly hard to kill if 15 of them are dead, right? Like just by ratio. But if you have 10 of them, they might get picked up in one combat phase, and that's nothing. So they become almost 2 units depending on how you reinforce them. Either they're a large damage soak, like a tank, that walks up the middle of the board, presents a threat that your opponent's never going to be able to deal with, and that's one way to play them. Or you take 3, 1, whatever, 10-mans, and then they become like utility units. We don't see that in 40k, or like very, very rarely. Units, generally speaking, are either damage units or they're not. It's just what it is, right? The other thing with skeletons, I should probably mention, is if the skeletons have more models than whatever it's attacking, they get an additional rend. So there's almost like a written in
Take
wink
30.
wink, like, hey, it gets a little stronger if you're taking in bigger numbers.
So if you take
I
one
believe
squad of 30 skeletons, do you ever want a second squad of 30 skeletons?
you might, but you can never do a third.
You
So
can
it
never do a third.
becomes right, and that kind of informs on list building a little bit more, because what happens if I want to build a list that's structured around these two 30-mana skeleton blocks, um, but all my other options are maybe bad without reinforcing them? Well,
Right.
that's where we start moving into monsters and heroes and more interesting list building choices because of the restriction of reinforcement points.
So this is back to that Terminator brick. You want one block, but if you
Mhm.
take two blocks, we're losing the support pieces that make that one block work, or our ability to be in elsewhere on the board.
Exactly, except it's written into the rules versus a judgment call we have to make, right? The problem with 40k is, well, what happens if the unit is both self-sufficient and you can take it at its maximum size and you can play as many as possible in 40k, right? Um, there are a lot of examples of this. We have like 10th custodians were like at the start of 10th or whatever. You could theoretically run as many as you wanted to. It allows for a little bit more of degenerative list building if
Yeah.
something is broken. There's no check, there's no control valve to you abusing a system like that, but it also just leads to less interesting like list building decisions, right?
Would the
You're
reserve
more,
mechanic work in 40k?
pardon?
Would the reserve mechanic that Age of Sigmar has work for 40k?
I don't think so. Not until like 11th edition, because we don't like it wouldn't hurt, but it's not like units aren't written um
Right.
for both minimum unit size and maximum unit size. They're very clearly written for one or the other.
Gotcha. Like either you want 10 Terminators. I don't think there's ever a point when you want 5. And if I look at like, I don't know, Battle Sisters, I don't think I ever want more than 10. I know that you used to be able to take 20. I don't know that having 10 more bolters is going to be a good thing. Other than, I guess, just, chalking up the board. And I don't know if you would want like Termagants in small units. So that is an interesting mechanic. You also mentioned Moon Clan Stabus. What's a Moon
Yeah,
Clan
I don't.
Stabba and why does that matter?
So let me pull up their thing here, because I don't know it off the top of my head like I do skeletons.
As you pull that up, I'm
Stab.
going to talk about one of my favorite Lumineth units is the Hurricane Windcharger. It's actually one of the units that really got me into Lumineth. I looked at it and I'm like, oh man, those guys are fucking weird. I want to play them. And they're essentially like these archers that ride on skeletons. And I've been including one off in my list. I have played at 2 Age of Sigmar tournaments. I'm about 15 games into Age of Sigmar. I went into one tournament like totally raw, playing like 1 or 2 games, and I'm like, I'm gonna fuck shit up. I ended up going 2-1 in that tournament, and one of the biggest successes in both that and the next tournament was this one unit of Hurricane Windchargers. Now, Hurricane Windchargers are cavalry, so they get about a move of 14, but they're archers, and they got 2 shots each, so they get about 10 shots. I think the sergeant gets an extra one. However, they're only at 12-inch range. They hit on 3s, they wound on 3s. I think they're -1. They do 1 damage. However, their other mechanic that they have is that in the fight phase, when they pile in, they get to pile in an extra 3 inches, and they can go in any direction they want. So one of the unique things they can do is they can always charge, and then if you don't want them to fight, you just pull them out, and your opponent essentially will not get to fight with an activation. It gets more complex, because if you charge with them, and then another combat, and then you have other combats going on, your opponent has to think whether or not they want to fight those gazelles. Because if they don't, they're never going to get the chance, and then they're going to get move blocked and never be able to deal with that. I had a game, I ended up losing because of Battle Ready, but it was against Seraphon. No, it was against Corn Demons. And he had some unit that was like better at combat than the gazelles. And there was like 3 turns of combat where he kept charging them, and the gazelles kept falling back out so that they couldn't get in combat, and then move blocking. And so he could never push onto my objective. He could never take it from me. I scored that objective so many times. And it ended up being a really, really good addition to the list. Here's the thing. Reinforcing that unit would be useless. I do not need 10 gazelles. And there is a maximum amount of these Hurricane Windchargers that I want in the list. Except for in a certain subfaction where all of a sudden they become battle line, and they get, I think, +1 to wound in that subfaction, which entirely changes that army, where you would want as many of these gazelles as possible. But for its function, you really only ever want, I think, 1, maybe 2 units. And in most Lumineth armies, if you go up to 3, it loses its effectiveness because they're not really that fighty. So what are they going to do? Threaten a fight for someone else? Well, at a certain point, it's only so useful. Moonclan Stabbers.
Yeah, so Moonclan Stabbers, their main gimmick is that they can contest objectives from 9 inches away instead of 6, provided that they have at least 20 models in the unit. The baseline is 20. So the question becomes, okay, well, I have this cheap battle line unit, right? It is 120 points.
120 points for 20 models. They must have like a 6-up or a 5-up save.
Yeah, they're easy to kill, which kind of comes into reinforcing them. If you have a 20-man and your opponent in their hero phase arcane bolts you, picks up 1, it loses its ability, right? Whereas if you have, you reinforce it up to 60, right? You're putting all those points into that. You're putting 360 into it. Hitting that 20 number is a lot more difficult, right? Especially when you can start bringing them back, and it's a whole thing. Not to mention Gloomspite's ability to bring back a unit at half strength after it's died, a la like Soulblight, right? If you're bringing back a unit with 30 models, again, it can do its effect, right? Whereas like a 10-man coming back can't. So you're trading off investing these points into something that is going to stay in one area, but you're getting more benefits for doing so, right? It becomes that meta game of like do I want 3 of these spread out, or do I want 3 of these that are more effective at the thing that they're doing, consolidated, right? And that's we see that a lot. Moonclan Stabbers, skeletons, they're all over the place in Age of Sigmar in battle line, but as well like we see it elsewhere in non-battle line units, right? Like to take the skeleton example, we have Graveguard, right, who are not
just
on paper
more killy skeletons, essentially.
right. That they're probably drawing, because they're your main hammer. They're one of the only things that do damage in Soulblight. They're bringing or tempting your reinforcement points towards them, just to do more damage. So that becomes another list building decision of, okay, well, do I want to unlock the abilities of the models that I need to like score points, or do I want to allocate that more towards damage, right? The reinforcement system makes you choose. Whereas in 40k, if such war scrolls were carried over, right, you would just make the easy decision. You'd say, okay, well, I'm going to put this many points into my damage. I'm going to put as many points as I can in my utility. And you're not forced to make a list building decision, right?
Do you think, like, yes or no, is Age of Sigmar list building better than 40k?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. It's not even close. I think, and we'll get into it in a little bit, but I think that it goes so much grander than just choices for unit sizes. This is just one cog in the machine of like why every single decision and every consideration you're making when you're list building is important versus 40k, which tends to be, what's my game plan? How, in what quantity do I have to take what units to achieve that game plan? A lot of the times, that's damage, right?
Eldar, in Eldar right now, I was actually talking, the most successful list is playing a block of Wraithguard that's like really hard to kill, an Avatar that's really hard to kill, and then building around that. So sometimes it's like also building stuff that can't be killed. And I think Necrons do something similar.
Necrons do exactly that, right? You have like your backline shooting just to deal with the stuff that can deal with your Necron blocks. Like Eldar probably does the same, right? You're taking these damage units to deal with things that deal with your Wraithguard. But at the end of the day, you're protecting Wraithguard, you're winning the game, right? So it's either all out on damage, you have a game plan, but there's no limitations.
Yeah.
So you don't have to make any considerations beyond what's the most effective way to do this. In AOS, we have to consider triumphs. They never matter. You have to consider...
Though there are some lists that they dick themselves down about 90 points so that they can get a triumph. Like they're fundamentally super important.
There's specific archetypes that absolutely make it work, but for every list, priority is important, right? And that's the big thing is I might have to take a substandard unit in order to fit it into a 1-drop, right? I just might have to. That's what it is. I might have to go wider, where I might want to go more dense on my damage because I need enough units to fit in a particular detachment, right? Or battalion. And to that, right, like this is going to eventually, roll into the double turn argument, but your list building determines how the rules of a lot of these missions are going to turn out. Like, and 40k doesn't have that. When you make a decision in list building, it will eventually come back in the game, right? In the way the rules play out, in the way that you score points beyond just like your secondaries,
I
which
wonder
is
if
super.
in 40k, because we're so early in that edition, if because what they're doing is they're essentially releasing subfactions with specific caveats on these benefits go to these units, and if we'll have like a level of complexity later in 40k where you can kind of mix and match that in order to build a more complex list. I'm also worried that that might not be the case because historically 40k hasn't really done that, and where you do take some units for mission play and some units for killing, it doesn't have the same quantifiers that other systems have. I know that you've never played Infinity, but Infinity you have likewise a certain amount of points. Usually the competitive scene plays at 300 points. And like point levels are like whatever, that's just like an arbitrary number of like these are how many points we can take for models. But in addition to that, they have something called support weapon cost, and you have 6 of them. And depending on your special weapons, all your special weapons cost support weapons cost. So you can't just spam, oh, this is the best fucking gun in the game, I'm taking 20 of them. In Infinity, you can take like 3, maybe 4, depending on what you're doing. Because there's another qualifier. So in Age of Sigmar, we have that in reinforcement points. We have that in battle line. But like you mentioned, we also have that in the structure of detachments. Because like you said, priority matters. Deciding who goes first or who goes second is very important. There are ways to mitigate that. If you're playing a much heavier shooting list, sometimes going first can be good for you. And people don't want to give you that opportunity because they need to get their defenses up. And so you can kind of play around with that. One of the biggest things, though, in all of these is definitely subfaction builds. So, like, one of the questions in list building is how do I identify, like, how much of a unit I want? How does that scale in reinforcements? How is that replicatable throughout a list with also having the support pieces? And the second part is that how do subfactions change that? Soulblight's very interesting, as you are a newer, recently risen Soulblight general. One of the things you discovered, especially on the internet, is how powerful they were and how powerful zombies are. Right?
Yeah.
There are subfactions that make them a little bit better. People want to have the 40-man zombie bricks, but what if a subfaction changes that? Because you're not playing the zombie subfaction. And even if 40-man zombies are some of the most efficient things at killing things because they do mortals when they die, do you want 2 of those? Do we want 3 of those? Like, how much of a good thing is a good thing? Even if sometimes that subfaction rule for it is centered on that. How do you differentiate between this is what I need to build a list, this is what I need to do in action, this is what I'm going to kill? That's really complicated in Age of Sigmar.
Yeah, it absolutely gets complicated. We like the easy answer maybe 3 or 4 months ago before we jumped in was, well, you take as many zombies as possible, but that's for a separate issue. Now that we have points that reflect probably the power of Soulblight units, you can't just take everything with zombie, in an ability and throw it into a list and call it a day. We have to make important decisions based on what the subfaction actually gives you, right? Verkos is the zombie relevant subfaction for Soulblight, and the main benefit, there's 2, I guess, is you get a 3-inch move in your hero phase for all your zombies around your general. Pretty important. They move 4 inches, so giving them a chargeable 7 inches is pretty good.
So for any listeners or watchers out there, one of the fundamental differences of Age of Sigmar is that most stuff doesn't just move 6. There is a lot of stuff that moves 4. There is a lot of stuff that moves 5. Like 6 is not necessarily your average movement, and the game is much more movement focused, so getting that is important. And the second thing I should mention is that most army books have like 6 or more subfactions, and there are special regiments of renown, which are like separate detachments that are subfactions, but they're much more restrictive. For example, Soulblight I think has 6 different subfactions, and each of the subfactions gives you a different bonus. So Aiden is talking about how Verkos is going to give some bonuses to zombies. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, this would be a relic, but as well you have heroic actions, which are things you do in the hero phase. You get to do one a turn, and one of them is you pick a Deadwalker unit, you add D3 of zombies, dire wolves, whatever, to that unit, and it can go above the unit maximum, right? There's some interesting rules interactions with this that make this a very powerful ability, but I won't get into those. What's more important is the 2 things are you get a 40-something% increase in movement on your zombies, as well as the ability to just make more of them, right? However, if that does raise the question of like, well, how many zombies are you going to end up taking? If you go all in on zombies, and let's say you're looking at your subfaction, you're like, hey, okay, fantastic, you take Gorslav or someone who cares about zombies, you're like, all right, I got all this. And then you play against a ranged army. You're just going to lose because you don't have the reach, and a lot of your abilities don't function against a ranged army like Caradron. So just because you have a themed subfaction doesn't mean you don't have to make more interesting and more broad, I guess, list building decisions in order to make what makes your subfaction work.
Okay, so Verkos, zombies, they come normally in what, 10 or 20? 20, right?
20 base, yeah.
Okay, most people are going to reinforce them to once, which is going to give you to 40.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You get all the benefits from that. 40 zombies are good. Do you ever want to spam that? Do you want 2 units of 40? Do you want 3 units of 40? Do you want 4 units of 40? What's the magic number, and how do you know?
Basically, you just have to look at what you're lacking. So if you're looking at a particular general's handbook, and you say, hey, okay, I'm getting some feedback. Off you.
Oh, okay, I'll mute.
No worries. Just because when you're taking zombies, you're taking 40 zombies, that costs you 300. You're taking a corpse car with that's 80. You're taking maybe another 20 man. You're taking a necromancer. It gets up there. But it hits a point where you're running out of things to do the mission. You're running out of things to actually deal damage, because zombies are very much like dictated by your opponent on whether or not they function. And the rest of your army becomes finding a way to prevent your opponent's choice. It's kind of like what you were saying with the wind chargers, right? Like, you could spam as many wind chargers as you want, right? And that would make your opponent's combat phase really weird, because suddenly they have to worry not about one unit potentially complicating things, but like 4 or 5. The problem is, you can limit your opponent's decisions, but if you have nothing to limit them to, if that makes sense, it's not doing anything. So what you have to identify is, okay, here are the missions. How do I play these? What job do zombies fulfill? And how can I optimize each different section of my game plan? What it used to be was you just take as many zombies as possible.
And that's kind of akin to what we see in traditional 40k subfactions, right? Where they're either you max everything out on damage because you're going to blow them up, leaf blower style, or you're going to make it so you have no good target and they're not going to be able to kill you.
Mm-hmm. That's what it was. I was speaking earlier about I'm feedbacking again. Sorry. About AdMac and 8th edition. The 2 main factions were Mars for damage, you get your rerolls. And then Styges, which just gave you old school lone op, right? You couldn't be shot outside. I think it was 18. And these are wildly different play styles, right? Or like theoretically should be, where one is towards utility. You're trying to actually play the game. You're trying to keep your opponent from making decisions. And one is, well, I want to blast you off the board as fast as possible. That doesn't exist in AOS. We can't make a call like that and go head first, because there are checks and balances in the game that prevent us from doing that. The double turn being one of them.
So the double turn is a good thing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it is as well, but only because there are so many aspects of the game that build towards it.
I think so too.
One of the things I like best about the subfactions within a lot of the armies is that it's almost like having 6 different armies in any one of these. Like, if you want to play Soulblight, there is not one correct way to play Soulblight. There are many. If you want to play Lumineth, there is not one correct one. There are many. And some of them are wildly different. Like the one that makes one specific unit battle line, the Wind Chargers, all of a sudden you go from wanting one unit of Wind Chargers to like, I don't know, because they're really good. I don't have enough Wind Chargers to play that, but I'm curious. There's another list that gives you, you get to ignore Rend 1 and 2, and there's like it stacks a little bit with certain other rules, and all of a sudden you have some 2-up or 3-up save guys that they're rolling their 2-ups and 3-ups, and in Age of Sigmar that's very powerful, because the way the Rend system works is there isn't that. There's a lot of Rend 1, there's a lot of Rend 0, Rend 2 is very rare, Rend 3 is exceptionally rare, and I've barely ever seen Rend 4, if at all.
How do you think that plays into like the hidden subfaction of like Techless?
Right. So one of the things I guess about Age of Sigmar is that if we have like Centerpiece themed models, they absolutely can change like how an army functions. You can play. There is two different popular Lumineth builds right now. One is called Emetrica, where they get to ignore some rend on some of their stone-based units, and another one is Zytrek, where everyone gets +1 to cast. And Teclis can be played in both, and he often is. But all of a sudden, if we put 1,000, 800-ish plus your spell portal points into a unit, that is an entirely different army than without it. And so it changes how you have to list build, because you have to list build around that unit. It changes how you're going to function for the mission. Historically, playing 40k and Age of Sigmar, when I look at any given list, I ask myself, what subfaction is going to give me the best chances at winning in my local meta? Because I think that has more of an impact than like a worldwide meta. And once I make my decision on what I'm going to play, I start off with like, what are some must includes? And if I want to play Teclis, either I'm playing Teclis or I'm not playing Teclis. And if I'm playing Teclis, then it has to be like, okay, Teclis is not going to be holding objectives. What's going to be holding objectives? And I think whether I'm playing Teclis or not, that's one of the first things I start with. How am I going to hold objectives? How am I going to score points? After I decide on one or two units, I ask myself, and this is true in both 40k and Age of Sigmar, how am I going to score mission secondaries? So in 40k right now, that's drawing cards. You need extreme mobility and high reactivity. In Age of Sigmar, there is specific ones that you can choose, and all of the like general ones are army positional, so you still need mobility and reactivity. And the specific army ones are much more specific, and in that case, it actually forces me to build certain things. One of the ones in Lumineth is it requires you to have up to 2 endless spells on the board. So if I want to be able to score that one consistently, and my opponents know I'm going to want to score that, I actually need to buy more than 2 endless spells. You probably want 3, so that you can like bait one out, challenge some other spells, and then make sure you're going to get 2 out for sure. So that's kind of how I ended up doing that. People think Teclis is 780 points. He's not. He's 780 points plus a spell portal, which is 80 points. And then he's not just 780 points plus 80 points for a spell portal. You also need a unit that's going to bodyguard him so that no one's going to be able to get to him. So now we're looking at 1,000 points. And then before you know it, you realize you're looking at 1,500 points in order for this list to function. And then you're looking at like 1,800 points because you have these things that are building for your secondaries. I mean, right. You tried experimenting not playing a Nagash build, as most Soulblights don't. You tried playing some of the other heroes. But then you also tried playing Nagash. How did it work for you? How did it change up your individual sub-faction?
So the way that I viewed or have come to view Nagash is that he's not really a model, which is kind of weird to say, but he's more like a 900 point index that you buy, where you don't care how much damage he does. He probably, like, everything considered, he probably does the damage worth of like a 250 point model, right? A quarter his junior. But
so you're paying 1,000 points for the damage output of 250 points.
Right. And this kind of factors into the fact that this game is not a damage game. Nothing would work if it was. There's no such thing as blowing your opponent up turn 1. And if you can accomplish that, you can't do it consistently. There's no way to.
You got to tell that to both the Caradron Overlords and Marathi and the Bow Snakes.
Yeah, you say, but that's the thing, right? Is you take something like turn 1 Gloomspite, you take turn 1 Marathi that are going to shoot you down a bunch. We've seen it historically where it's been pretty bad with like Sentinels and stuff. But disregarding outliers, the game is not a damage game, because maybe Marathi or Bow Snakes might blow you up turn like one game or whatever, but the next game, what happens if Marathi and Bow Snakes get double turned and they have fragile units that can't actually play the game after they get double turned?
Well, I played against Marathi and the Bow Snakes at a recent tournament. He actually played against Teclis Lumineth twice, which was kind of funny because it was pretty rare. And in the first game, he did get the first turn and he blew up the opponent's Teclis. When I played against him, I knew that I was going to go first because I built my list to be a 1-drop. And I carefully positioned that I knew I was going to go first, and I was going to tie up the Bow Snakes because they can't shoot out of combat if they get there. So he either had the choice of deploying very far back where the Bow Snakes are not going to get into the game, or getting blown up in the turn 1, and he chose wrong. So even in sometimes when we have these sub-factions that can do big things on turn 1, and I guess giving you a hard time about the KO and the Bow Snakes things, there is counterplay to it in list building.
Yeah, there has to be, because otherwise, it would just be Marathi. I think that Nagash is a very expensive piece of faction terrain. that gives you a ton of benefits, right? For those of you who don't know, we have, as Soulblight players, we have two big things. One is when a unit dies, we can bring back a replacement unit with half of its models. And as well, we have the ability to heal or restore units within heroes by, I believe it's three or four models in each unit, or 3 or 4 wounds worth, right? And you can do that multiple times. What Nagash does is he just lets you do that twice for both of those. There are different conditions around how either of them work, but it amplifies the other 1,100 points you have with those rules, on top of unlocking your entire, like 8 casts of your entire book. And so what he really gives you is, here's your book, here's a bunch of extra stuff you can do. You can do any and all of this, and you don't have to worry about leaving it down to chance. The caveat being, you're getting no damage, and 900 of your points are locked up in one unit. So you have to be very careful about the rest of your list building in order to make it work. That being
Plus your
said,
spell portal, plus your screening,
plus
plus
your spell portal, yeah. So you have a lot that you have to do. And at the end of the day, like, I don't do damage, right? I think with this list, I'm sitting at a probably 75 or an 80 right now, and percent win rate, and I don't kill units. I think my last game I played was against Aiden, and I killed 2 units, I think, and one of them was on accident. Like, it's just not how it is supposed to play. And I think to a certain degree, Techless is similar. You have all of these, like, you have a lot more damage-based spells, but theoretically, you could piece out Techless and get way more damage, but that's not what it's about. It's about giving yourself more options in the game to play the mission, and whether that's targeted mortal wound bombs or whether that's like defensive buffs, the end result's the same. You're presenting a larger utility threat on the board rather than a larger damage threat. That's why I really like Nagash.
I think to some extent, any of these competitive war games, whether we're talking Warhammer Fantasy, 9th Age, Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, which I would call a competitive war game, Infinity, it can't just be all about damage. And if your game is only about doing damage, that's not an interesting game, because then we have systems where, well, whoever goes first wins. So there needs to be some sort of modifier or check versus who's doing damage, who's doing like utility, what's more important, is there a mix important? And that works really well when we talk about like the double turn. Nagash, if he gets a double turn, is that devastating?
If I get a double turn, most of the time, I'm giving my opponent the double turn, right? For those of you who don't know, the priority roll for the first turn, it's determined on who has less drops, so whoever deploys last. But after that, it's a roll-off. So you could get double turned 2 or 3 times, right? And you could double turn your opponent 2 or 3 times, right? Eventually, it'll average out. But the thing with that is, just because if I go into a game, or if I go into the system and I play 1,000 games and my priority roll is like 50% wins and losses, right? If I'm running a 3-drop army, that doesn't mean that I'm going to benefit from the priority roll 50% of the time, because I have to make a decision as to whether or not I'm going to take the first turn of the battle round or give it, which you have the option of doing. Same with the first battle round. Oftentimes, especially in this GHB, you want to go second. You have so many benefits, whether it's an extra cast, which is equivalent to saying, hey, I want to give something a +1 or a free all-out defense, right? That's what Mystic Shield is. You get that for free. Or whether or not you're dictating which objectives give you more points, right? That's what the second player gets to do. Or you're getting extra, you're getting extra, help me out here, Arthur.
The Andor and Locust stuff.
Yeah, Andorian, right, that stuff. You just get so many more benefits for
more primal dice in the bank.
Yes, more command points. You get more resources, right? And so it becomes a question of, hey, do I want the damage turn or do I want the utility turn? And oftentimes, especially because I'm not a damage army, you just take the utility turn, because you're saying, okay, you're going to chew this much more into me, but because I'm built not to care about that, you might kill an extra 10 zombies, but at the end of the day, that zombie unit's still going to be there, and I'm going to have more resources to push it and get me more points, because at the end of the day, you just care about winning the game. You don't care about how much damage you did, how much damage you received. There's exceptions to this. Again, if we're playing against something like Marathi, you probably don't want to give them the double turn unless you know it's going to be a good thing. But your ability to decide and understand when you should take the second and first turn is, in my opinion, the most important skill to learn coming from 40k.
And it makes it more complex when you look at some of the scoring, because objectives are scored at the end of your turn. And that's player turn. So like the good secondaries in 40k for some time have been the ones you get to score on your player turn because you have agency. In Age of Sigmar, all the secondaries are scored at the end of the turn, and the primary is scored at the end of your turn. Also, the grand strategy is scored at the end of turn 5. So in many cases, it is better, if you can, to go second. However, going second in any of these games creates a system where someone gets to do damage to you first, limiting your ability to do damage back. And if your game is only based on damage, that creates a system of whoever strikes first wins, right? That first turn argument.
Which is why it could never work in 40k, because doing damage twice or getting to shoot or fight twice is unbelievably strong. You would win the game outright 90% of the time if that was a system. But it's not the same in AOS. And a lot of people will say, hey, well, doesn't this, lead to randomness, right? I have less impact as a player because I could just lose my priority roll, right? Or make the wrong call even if I win it. But the data doesn't really show that. I think last edition, Richard Siegler, right, who I think a lot of people believe are among the top 3 best players in the world, was walking around GTs with maybe a 72% win rate. Whereas we have, what's his name? Gavin.
The Age of Sigmar player who has like 100% or like a 90% win rate.
Gavin Greiger's the worldwide, he's the best player. He's been a very, very, top ranking player for a few seasons, so this isn't an outlier. But he's 30-0 over his last 6 GTs, or rather his best performing GTs the last 12 months. And that's unheard of in 40k, right? And so if you have a player that is consistently pumping out 100% win rates, and he's doing it with different armies, right? How can we infer that the game is decided randomly off that, right?
So here's the ultimate thesis. The double turn is a good mechanic because Age of Sigmar is a competitively built wargame from the ground up. But it's only a good mechanic because it is built from the ground up. Because the list building decisions, like reinforcements, like subfactions, the sub-list building decisions, like your secondary scoring, and like the sub-list build decisions, like choosing whether or not you're going to have tech lists or something else, dramatically change the entire game. Because you're not just building for damage. You also have to build for utility. And the game forces you to do that. It really does. So if you have a game where you're spending 1,000 points to get 250 points worth of damage, because the utility is more valuable, and utility can be like things like move blocking or getting extra movement or just slowing your opponent's movement. That makes it a situation where you can always plan at the end of your turn to look at it and be like, okay, whether or not I get the double turn or someone gets the double turn on me next, I'm going to be okay. And I think that's what makes, like you said, a good 40 or a good Age of Sigmar general from a great one. Making those decisions to be like, yep, I went first on round 2. It could be 2 full player turns till I get to go again. So how am I going to go interact with that? If you're going first in any given round, you are facing the prospect of a double turn. So you need to get your defensive buffs up. You need to play utility. You need to ask yourself, where can my opponent get in 2 turns? And obviously, it's not a busted mechanic. It doesn't make the game bad if players can go off 100% win rate against other players of a similar caliber, like Gavin, like you mentioned.
I think that's been the biggest thing learning competitive is understanding that the double turn system is it's a control valve. That's what it is. It keeps you from doing degenerate stuff. I can't, like, Wraith Knight Eldar couldn't work as well turn 1 indirecting my opponent if it would just fold to a double turn, right? Now, to be fair, it would also benefit a lot from that double turn, but provided there was a balance to make that list building decision lower drops, right? Or rather higher drops, it wouldn't be the same list. It wouldn't find the same success, right? You'd have to make more creative choices that stray away from damage in order to fit within what you want as that Eldar player. I love that. I think that's the most clever thing about this system, and I think that's something that a lot of people. The double turn gets a lot of bad optics from 40k players because they're thinking in a damage mindset. They're not thinking in a utility mindset because 40k rewards so much more damage. It doesn't care about utility. You have a 40-point unit that's going to go in the corner. It's going to score you a secondary. It's going to die. That's the extent of utility in 40k, and that's not a bad thing. But it is for sure different. It's a different game altogether. I might have a cavalry unit, right, like your wind charges or whatever, that are fulfilling multiple jobs. They're scoring me secondaries. They're tying up units. They're killing things, right? And because they have these different jobs or whatever, they're a lot better for an army that wants to prioritize on both the double turn and maybe not getting the double turn.
I think that there are always exceptions to the rule as well. So, well, I actually believe when we talk about the double turn, one of the tournament games I played against was Fire Slayers, and it was a build of Fire Slayers where he was playing like 3 Magmadroths and Gortrek. And so for those of you not familiar with that, a Magmadroth is essentially I think like a 400 or 500 point like monster. They're very killy, and I made him go first, and I went second because I had the priority roll because I built my list for that. And then at the end of turn 1, I got to go second, so like I obviously got to do my damage, and then we rolled, and I won the priority. And I did end up taking a double here. Now here's the thing: what my opponent did, he shoved those 3 Magmadroth as far at my face as he possibly could, but he didn't need to. The objectives in this mission were placed in such a case: if he would park 1 Magmadroth 18.1 inches away from Teclis, I'm not doing mortal wounds. And if he just plays the mission, plays the objectives, plays with a utility mindset, the double turn doesn't matter. But he didn't. And he had what I maybe is a bit more of the degenerate list you're talking about. It's losing to double turn because 1, he didn't play for it, and 2, his list wasn't designed to be interactive enough to be able to do it. So there are some other lists that try to spam things like Gortrek and things that can be like unrendable in an effort to be like, come get me. And I wonder like to what extent the double turn kind of stops these degenerate lists, these lists that are not really good for the game. They're not really fun to play against. They're kind of just like a stat check or a damage check or things like that.
Yeah, I think we have to invite a lot of our slow grow league players to kind of identify that for themselves, right? As they're building lists, as they're increasing in points, what are their different decisions that they're making when they realize, oh, I took the things with the biggest numbers and the lowest, ballistics or 2 hits, 2 wound characteristics. Why didn't it work? What could I have done better? What decisions could I have made to avoid getting caught out by the fact that I'm just like playing damage? I think that's going to be really interesting, watching and talking to players as they're absorbing this mindset, because a lot of our players are from 40k, and seeing how they change that. That's going to be one of the most interesting things to me going into winter here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I look forward to seeing it. I look forward to continuing to play Age of Sigmar and like seeing how this matters between like list building and how to foster a competitive mindset into that. Not that sometimes there can't be like degeneracy. Games Workshop is not a perfect company, and I don't think they make perfect games. I think that they exist to sell models, and I think that's going to happen in any game system they make, whether that's Necromunda or Kill Team or Age of Sigmar or 40k. And you'll see that as these 40k codexes keep on coming out. Whatever one is out recently, or at least one of every 3 recently, will be probably overpowered. And we're going to see that right now because in Age of Sigmar, the Cities of Sigmar codex finally got released. They finally got all their models. And that is a army that is built with it needs some points changes, and I think people know that. Maybe we're going to see a day 1 fact. The 90 Fusilier list is not fun, right? That might be problematic. The Pontifex is not fun. Hopefully we'll see some changes in that. Or here's a counter argument for that. What if with the Andoran season, when everyone is playing all of these wizards to get all these awesome spells off, what if the Pontifex is the balance to that, saying like, whoa, watch the amount of wizards you take, because all of a sudden you could run into this where you're being punished for taking too many wizards.
Yeah, there's a line to walk. I think the ally system as we have it doesn't love Zenestra as a check, because theoretically any order army could take them, bar Seraphon, I think. And that makes it a little bit complicated because you never want to be in a system where the biggest, super faction or whatever can take, the same 150 point character model that's going to get nerfed in 3 months, and then nobody's going to take them, right? That's never good. But that being said, if Cities is good, and it will be, the Sinestro does absolutely represent that check to, the latter half of the season here, where we don't want to go wide on Wizards. You're a Lumineth player, Arthur. Like you know this, better than anybody. It's annoying that you have to consider, okay, well, I can't just maximize on the season. I have checks to make it work. I think Nullstones kind of wanted to do that, and I think from what I heard, we're at about a 15% play rate for Nullstones, which is not like nothing, but it's not as potentially dangerous as just looking at a Sinestro across the board and saying, oh, okay, well, I either have to come to you right now or I lose, right? that's the kind of the problem that she represents for players like Lumineth, Tzeentch, right?
Well, if she becomes very popular, I think what I'm going to end up doing is in Lumineth you have decisions where you take a Sergeant or not to make that unit a Wizard. And if I'm really worried, if there is so many Sigmar or Cities of Sigmar players that that becomes a problem, I just stop taking the Wizards. And we start taking units like the Blade Lords and the Hammer guys, because they're not Wizards, and the Hurricane Wind Chargers, and we swap a subfaction, we pivot to adapt the meta, and we play the game.
So it's cool that you can do that. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, it's really... the Sergeants that make them Wizards. And actually, I think that, when we look at a lot of these Age of Sigmar armies, there is a lot of choice. If you look at the base game, it's like, oh, well, your War Scroll is just your box. But it's not, because you can make them battle line, and you can add buffs, and there are support pieces, and some units make other units battle line. For a system, They have finally created a system where your army can be pretty much take anything you want, but, right? And I think the whole point is giving players agency, because when players have agency, when they have the ability to adapt and make decisions, it creates a great game. And I think that's why I love Age of Sigmar, and it is the competitive game that I wish 40k was. That one's just for Scott. I think that was pretty much everything we wanted to chat about today. I think we nailed all of that. So I have a challenge for anyone listening out there. It's to go out and build a Age of Sigmar list. And as you're doing it, write down the order in which you are building the list and the reasons why you're doing it. So kind of check yourself for, like, how are you doing that? And then reflect. Ask yourself, like, am I building the best possible list? Have I considered... is this too much of a good thing? Do I have enough support? Do I have enough damage? Do I need more damage? Do I have enough utility? What is my local meta doing? How can I adapt to that? Or is the unit that might better fit in here? Am I playing my secondaries? These types of things. But I think that's pretty much all we're going to chat about. So catch us in the Slow Grow. Catch us on Facebook. Catch us on Instagram and YouTube. Follow the Trident socials. Can't forget to plug our Patreon. Thank you very much for our few Patreon members who are supporting us. That goes a long way. We have some very exciting news to announce with Trident Wargaming coming shortly, including a major next year. I'll leave that alone. An Age of Sigmar tournament in February or March. I'll leave that one alone as well. And some other events. So stay tuned, everyone, and thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thanks, guys.